Hey guys, welcome to Social Relations. Buckle up for a long one. I'm going to try to get you through this as quickly as possible. Like the rest of social psychology, a lot of terminology, not a whole lot that you can bypass. If you want to try to streamline it, there is a file on Blackboard that gives you kind of a general idea of the terms that you absolutely need to know for the test. This section is going to talk about a variety of topics in depth: prejudice, aggression, conflict to attraction, altruism, and peacemaking. It's important that you review these with your textbook. It'll give you a little bit more in depth. We are going to start with person perceptions and how we form impressions of others. In other words, how we look at people and what we think about them. To be fair, we do this in about a tenth of a second. So that entire idea of don't judge a book by its cover, that's how we do in fact judge people, by their covers, and it's usually off of previous information that we have about the world. So while it's best to get to know people, it's also hard for us to kind of pull back this tendency to use schemas and stereotypes and previously learned information to form what we think about somebody. The other thing is that often we have to then evaluate whether or not our knee-jerk reaction was correct. It is important to realize that in that 1/10 of a second, some of our impressions are going to be inaccurate, but it's because our impressions are always based off of our previous understanding. In sociology, we call it the halo effect, but it's this idea that we tend to apply to people who are attractive, desirable characteristics like honesty, intelligence, hardworking. And there's actually very little correlation that exists between being attractive and positive or desirable personality traits, or at least no more than what you would see in the general population. The reason that people have this idea of physical appearance being somehow an indicator of your personal attributes has a lot to do with overexposure in the media. Look at most of our villains versus most of our heroes, and you see this. What is good is beautiful, and what is bad is ugly. What is desirable is beautiful, and what is undesirable is ugly. Very simply, you can look at Disney. Now, everyone loves to point out that not every single one of the villains is unattractive, but just remember that, Snow White's stepmother becomes the evil old hag, and Gaston never really becomes ugly, but the Beast definitely becomes beautiful. And so there's always going to be a chance for an anomaly to pop up where the unattractive is desirable. But for the most part, from a very early age, whether it's superheroes or princesses or just regular cartoon characters, we tend to make what is beautiful good and what is less beautiful or even average as not good. So this idea of attributing good personality traits to good-looking people, we often do this in about a tenth of a second. An interesting fact that comes with that is that our instant judgments, those ones that we make in about a tenth of a second, have a high correlation with judgments that we can make over time. Whether it is Frozen or Nanny McPhee, I really enjoy when Hollywood takes these characters and kind of changes the dynamic. It always shocks little kids, and I think it's good for them. So my kids, when they watched Nanny McPhee, which is just a modern day version of Mary Poppins, they sat there, and the first thing that my daughter said is, "Mommy, why is there a witch?" And I said, "Well, why is she a witch?" And she said, "Well, she's ugly, and so she's bad." And I said, "Well, but she's not. She's the good person." And she had to think about that maybe her outward appearance didn't indicate who she was on the inside. Later, we watched Frozen for the first time, and the entire idea of the prince actually being the bad guy really kind of surprised my kids. Like, that was something that they weren't ready for, because they were waiting for the predictable, the ugly, the gruesome, somehow that was going to be the bad guy. So it's something that we actually socialize very early on in children. When we look at stereotypes, make sure that you understand that a stereotype and a prejudice, they're not always the exact same thing. So stereotypes, a generalized, often overgeneralized belief about a group of people. When we look at people who become prejudiced, however, that is going to be an overgeneralization, negative belief about a group of people. So stereotypes we use because they're based off of schemas. There are these quick shortcuts. Usually we have them about sex or age or ethnic group or occupation or whatever. When we talk about this in class, I'll ask everybody to close their eyes and tell me to raise their hand if the first thing when I say the word doctor, the first thing that they visualize is an adult man. And if it's an adult man who maybe is in his like 40s or 50s, and you check the hands that come up, or a nurse being female, or an athlete being a male in his 20s, a homeless person, I'll even ask, I'm like, all right, whose first thought of a homeless person is a child? And the reality is that we have a greater population of homeless that are, literally homeless with their families, and so it's usually children. We use whatever pops into our head off of experience. So for a homeless person, often students think of the time that they maybe have walked through Washington, D.C. and seen someone that was homeless, and that becomes almost their stereotype or their archetype for a homeless person, or maybe what they've seen on television, whether it's the age, the gender, the race, etc. We tend to have kind of first knee-jerk responses to these. Now, it's not that you don't have female doctors or male nurses or professional female athletes, but what you have more exposure to, what often comes to mind first, what are you building this off of? And so it really does often depend on what first comes to mind, that stereotype. Stereotyping is a normal cognitive process. It's automatic. It is meant to save time, and it's meant to save effort. So when we talk about things where people are talking about implicit bias, that's stereotyping. That's what that is. It is your understanding of the world based off of your experiences for your lifetime. And so if your experiences are constrained by Fauquier County and where you've lived your entire lifetime, that's all your stereotypes can be built off of what your experiences are. So when we're talking about trying to get rid of implicit bias, we can try to get people to have much more differentiated experiences and have more interaction with a variety of people and places and things. But your brain still goes back to its default setting. So they've shown, the American Psychological Association came out with research that showed that people who go to implicit bias training, the implicit bias training lasts for no more than 24 hours. And usually the training itself is no longer useful after about 30 minutes after taking the class. And that's simply because you cannot rewrite that level of neurological connection. It allows us to simplify our world. Stereotypes allow us to simplify things. If you walk into a room and you're looking for a teacher, you're immediately probably going to look for an adult, male or female, somewhere probably in their 30s or 40s. Chances are you're not looking for a 22-year-old or a 21-year-old. Chances are you're probably also not looking for somebody who's 70 or 80. So you've already simplified this kind of concept down to a certain age range. Then you're probably going to go with style of dress or whatever other thing that fills in that stereotype. They can be broad overgeneralizations, they can ignore diversity within social groups, and they can be inaccurate. They're not perfect. They are shortcuts, and with any shortcut there comes flaws. Another thing that you need to look at is an illusory correlation. This is when you estimate the probability of an encounter or probability of a social characteristic by the number of times that you can personally confirm it. When we talk about things and people say, well, I think of this because my doctor was, or my teacher was, or my blah, blah, blah. They use that one case or very few cases to confirm their entire rule. This is when people overestimate what they expect to see. And interestingly enough, for an illusory correlation to take foot or to take hold, you really only need one instance of something that's unusual or memorable to confirm it. And then you will discount anything that doesn't confirm that rule and then expect more confirmation anytime you can find something. So confirmation bias may lead us to not only see the evidence of our expectations, but to believe in these illusory correlations. Prejudice, this is where you want to be careful. So stereotypes have a biological function. Prejudice, however, is not biological. This is an unjustifiable, usually negative attitude towards a group and its members. And the reason I say usually negative is that some people will say that there are things like positive prejudice. But prejudice, no matter what, simplifies people down to a single rule or idea. And even if it's something that's meant to be positive, it may actually inhibit that person from receiving help when needed. So components of prejudice involved stereotype beliefs, usually negative feelings, and discriminatory action. So this is much more involved than just using a shortcut in cognition. Discrimination, behaving differently, unfairly towards members of a group. And again, prejudice is often directed towards cultural, ethnic, or gender groups. Person perception is swayed by physical attractiveness because we associate it often with reproductive health. There is the entire symmetry hypothesis. The other thing that we look at is in-group versus out-group, and we'll talk about in-group bias. Stereotypes very early developed from The idea that in hunter-gatherer societies, your group allowed you to survive, a competing group may not have done as well, or there may be something dangerous about them. And so we see anybody who is like us, that is part of our crowd, as somehow more beneficial than other people who are not part of our crowd. Prejudice can work at a knee-jerk response type level. However, it's important for people who are looking at this topic to understand that sometimes prejudice does come unintentionally from people's backgrounds, but also sometimes people perceive what they want to perceive when no prejudice is present. And ultimately, at the end of the day, trying to be a kind and a good person is really what you guys should be striving for. Try to correct prejudice if you happen to notice ones that you have. Try to get more informed about people, but also don't seek out the worst in others. Don't always assume that everything is coming from a prejudicial standpoint. If someone's behavior is ambiguous, people are more likely to interpret it with a way that's consistent with their personal expectations. So if you think all people in column A are going to act like A, B, and C, and you don't know how to interpret their behavior, that's what you might see. And it might not be that they're being prejudiced, it might be that you're interpreting prejudice where none exists. The us versus them is going to exist forever. Whether it is you and your peer group versus other peer groups, or whether it's your family versus another, whether it's your country versus another. The in-group is the people that you see as part of your group. We have a tendency to favor our own group, known as the in-group bias. You need to know that term. An out-group is the them. It's anybody who's not in that group. So on a very simple way, you can look at JV versus varsity. Varsity always seems to think that they're better than JV, but then JV is going to have an in-group bias where they think that they're somehow better on other levels than maybe varsity. And both groups are going to sit there and consolidate who they are and kind of reaffirm their kind of group by proving that they're not this other group. And it's not always nasty or mean, it's just we're better because we're in this group than that group. And it has to be there because it allows for groups to survive and to feel connected to each other. In class, we would look at this, and I know some of you guys know who Steve Buscemi is, just based physically off of appearance. And I picked famous people because, again, there's going to be more to them than just looks. So 1 and 2 are famous actors. Who would you trust with your child? Who would you trust with $1 million? Who would you trust with whatever? If you didn't know who they were, but you had to look at them physically, and just from their faces, 1, 2, and 3, who would you choose? If each one of them came up to you with their arm in a sling and said, could you help me take my groceries to my car? Would you be willing to help number 1, number 2, or number 3 with no other background knowledge? Often people would sit there and say, I would feel probably more comfortable with number 3. Number 3 would be Ted Bundy, who was a notorious serial killer. But that was one of his ruses, and that's why it worked, because he looked so normal. No one is going to argue that prejudice has been completely erased. We know that there are still prejudices against interracial marriage and gender and homosexuality and race, and that prejudice still does exist. However, it has decreased. So if you're looking at something like interracial marriage between 1958 and 2003, the idea of people approving between interracial marriage has increased from maybe it looks like possibly 5% up to about 60, well actually 70% or so, and probably even higher now that we're in 2018. When we're looking at this, a lot of prejudices have decreased. The other thing that we look at is whether we're talking about women for president or whether or not neighborhoods have the right to be segregated. Those opinions have become more in line with tolerance. So more people agree that a woman could be president or that they'd be willing to vote for a woman as president. And most people agree that there is no reason that neighborhoods should be segregated, that people have the right to live in integrated neighborhoods. So again, racial and gender prejudice, both of those have decreased over the years as well. This research that was done in 2003 is often the basis for a lot of implicit bias studies. The idea that 9 out of 10 white respondents were slow in responding to words like peace or paradise when they saw a black photo or a black individual's photo. This doesn't mean that they don't believe that peace or paradise goes with the photo or the person. It's just that they were slower in responding. There was a cognitive delay. So there wasn't the same strength of response between the two for those individuals. Prejudice still happens towards women. Having been a female police officer and having been in more than just one kind of occupation, there still is sexism, but not to the extent where it really seems to bar you from attaining goals, and maybe not to the same extent that I personally see in the media. That seems like it's been ramped up and kind of overdone. And there are some positives about being a woman. More people feel positively toward women than men. Women rated picture B, which was a more feminized picture, as higher for matrimonial purposes, seeing women as being more open and desirable. Not that they thought the picture B was a woman, it's just that the softer features were more feminized. So why does prejudice arise? We'll talk about these three topics: inequality, divisions, and scapegoating. So inequality. Social inequality increases prejudice, so having money or power or prestige consolidated in the hands of a few increases the likelihood that in-group and out-group kind of biases start to exist. The in-group wants to consolidate their power. They may actually start to have a negative perception or group perception of the out-group. Scapegoat theory. You need to know the term scapegoat. So a scapegoat is somebody that you place blame on even though they don't deserve it. With Hermann Rösching, a Nazi leader, he once explained the need for the Nazis to have a scapegoat. And they said, or he said, if the Jew did not exist, we should have had to invent him. In other words, to continue to push forward the Nazi agenda, they needed a despised outgroup. They needed somebody to kind of gang up against, to kind of focus their attention on. And that enhanced their group's ability to act. Despised outgroups can boost in-group members' self-esteem. I know I'm good because I'm not that group, or I know I'm better because I'm in my group and not that group. Scapegoating, again, placing blame where blame does not belong. So while the first one is just cute because they're cute little goats and hopefully scapegoat sticks in your head, it's the second cartoon that I prefer. I'll give you more responsibility from now on. Everything that goes wrong around here will be your responsibility. In other words, he's creating a scapegoat. No matter what, whether it's your choice or your responsibility or not, you will be the scapegoat. And then the cognitive roots of prejudice. One way that we simplify our world is by putting things into categories, and we categorize people. Now, whatever race you're part of, you seem to think that you can identify people of your race very clearly and that everyone else maybe kind of looks similarly. I know that sounds really horrible to say, but if you were to go to China and show them a picture of 25 different people from America that all had the same racial background, so you picked 25 Caucasian people, they would probably say they all look the same. Now, when we look at this, you have this foreign sunbathers may think Balinese look alike, and it's not that they look identical, that there's no distinctions, but that they just look very similar. We're actually better at seeing differences within our own racial categories than between categories. So we categorize people. We put people into gender and race and other very simplified categories because it makes it easier for us to kind of identify them and simplify our world. When we look at cognitive roots of prejudice, vivid cases can create stereotypes. So prior to 9/11, the idea of someone from the Islamic religion being a terrorist was not a predominant thought here in the United States. But the availability heuristic, our tendency to make a shortcut in decision making based off of what's most available to us, changed that. After 9/11, that was what a terrorist was. It was no longer a Timothy McVeigh or maybe the Irish Republican Army or something like that. It became very different. When we look at vivid cases, often when we're looking at things like mass shootings, most people say it's all done by people who are mentally ill or crazy. And it's easy to assume that most mentally ill people are prone to acts of violence, but the reality of it, if you go past that kind of very simplistic heuristic, is that 4% of all violent acts are committed by people who are mentally ill. Only 4%. That means that 96%, change the framing, 96% are committed by people who are perfectly healthy and sane. So the 4% is a drop in the bucket. Maybe it's the 96% of people that are committing these violent acts that we want to be concerned about. Normally in class we would take a pause and I would read you this lovely story about a woman who cheats on her husband. And she cheats on her husband, and when she cheats on him, he works nights. They live on one side of a river. She takes a ferry across to the other side of the river. She meets up with lover one, and before anything gets too serious, she will always break up with one of her boyfriends. So lover one lives across the river. She thinks it's getting too serious. She gets into a fight with him, and he kicks her out of the apartment. She goes back to the ferry boat, and she realizes that she didn't bring any money with her. So she doesn't want to walk home. The road home is very dangerous. There's what they call highwaymen that will attack people on the road and rob them. So she doesn't want to walk, so she goes back to lover number one's apartment and asks if he would give her money. He's upset and angry. He says no. She goes to another previous lover's apartment and she says, will you give me money so I can take the ferry? He's still upset from her, breaking up with him a while ago. He says no. She goes to the ferry boat captain and says, you know me. I'm a regular customer. Would you let me pay you later? And the ferry boat captain says, no, I can't do that. So she chooses then to walk home. As she's walking home, she's stopped by a highwayman and he demands all her money. She doesn't have any. And in the ensuing scuffle of him trying to get money from her, he stabs and kills her. Then the question comes, whose fault is it for the woman's death? And you have 6 characters: the husband, the wife, the 2 lovers, the ferryboat captain, and the highwayman. And I would ask you to listen descending order, those responsible or most responsible for the woman's death. So literally most responsible to least responsible. Often people, when they hear the story, the first person that they make responsible for the woman's death often is the woman, when the only person that's truly responsible for her death, or at least most responsible, should be the highwayman. So regardless of any other previous bad behavior, you don't have the right to stab somebody or kill them. Now, she's done other things, but what we see from this is something called the just world phenomenon. This idea that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, or otherwise what we call people getting their comeuppance. That she deserved this in some way. So, tendency of people to believe that the world is just, so the world is a good place, and people get what they deserve, and they in fact deserve what they get. So in other words, she deserved to have what happened to her because she had done these other horrible things. Now, some people might argue that other people had kind of a role in this, but truly the most important person is the highwayman. You shouldn't rob or kill people. It's his fault regardless of other bad behaviors that she may have had. And often we'll use hindsight to justify this just world phenomenon that we have. Now that we know the outcome, now that we know that something bad had happened, then we sit there and say they should have known it all along. So again, hindsight bias plus the just world phenomenon. After learning an outcome, the tendency to believe that we could have predicted it beforehand, and then that may contribute to blaming the victim and forming a prejudice against them. So in other words, this idea that we know the outcome, they should have been able to predict the outcome, they didn't predict the outcome, therefore the outcome is now their fault. Now we're moving on to aggression. Aggression, any physical or verbal behavior intended to hurt or destroy. So aggression doesn't always have to be hitting, punching, kicking. It can also be verbal aggression or emotional aggression. It can be done reactively, out of hostility, or proactively as a calculated means to an end. So proactive hostility, you pick a fight with somebody so you can. You pick a fight with somebody so you can break up with them without having to be upset or have it on your conscience. Reactively, someone said something mean to you and so you respond in kind. So aggressive behavior emerges from the interaction of biology and then also from learned experience. We are going to look at the following 3 influences: genetic, neural, and biochemical. Genetic influences. We know for a fact that some animals have been bred for aggression. You see this with dogs often when they're meant to be attack dogs. For sport and then also for research, twin studies show aggression may be genetic. In men, aggression is possibly linked to the Y chromosome. They also have larger amygdalas and they produce more testosterone. Neural influences, here we have the neural, the amygdala, and the frontal lobe are involved in aggression. So larger frontal lobe should mediate aggression. Larger amygdala might mean that you are more. Biochemical influences. Here we get into testosterone. So animals with diminished or lower testosterone become more docile, and those who are injected with increased testosterone become more aggressive. So again, testosterone exposure can either increase or decrease aggression. When we look at the psychology of aggression, dealing with aversive events, learning aggression is rewarding, observing models of aggression, and acquiring social scripts will be the next 4 things that we talk about. Frustration aggression principle. There's a cute little video linked in here if you have a chance to look at it. It's about 2 stick guys who want this one stick girl, but they don't really tell each other that they're attracted. One guy makes his move, the other guy gets upset, and instead of getting upset with himself for not making the move, he gets upset at the other guy. So this one says, you will get frustrated. Frustration will lead to aggression. That's it. That's what frustration aggression principle is. So the blocking or the attempt to achieve a goal causes anger, which can generate aggression. You put your dollar into the Coke machine. The Coke machine does not give you back your Coke. You get frustrated. Your frustration then leads to your aggression. You start to kick the Coke machine. When aggression leads to desired outcome, you learn that aggression might be good. So this explains bullies. If being aggressive leads to them getting what they want, or people paying attention to them, or whatever it might be, they may increase this behavior. This can also be something that's modeled. If you learn that your parents being loud or yelling or hitting you, they get what they want, you may turn around and take that modeled behavior and use that towards your siblings or other people. Cultures that favor violence bred violence. So the Scotch-Irish settlers in the South had more violent tendencies than their Quaker Dutch counterparts in the Northeast. In other words, if you're Scotch-Irish, clan mentality and violent behavior was actually often considered desirable, where being a Quaker, that really was not a desirable characteristic. When we look at social relations, juvenile violent crime rates and arrests, there was a huge spike in the 90s, and then it has since then gone down. The question is, why did that happen? And we're still not 100% sure, because if it was something as simple as video games and television and video games have become increasingly more violent, the rates should have continued. One thing that we do look at is coercion and viewing habits of sexually promiscuous and coercive men. So when we're looking at this, there has been no substantiated correlations between violent pornography and rape. However, men who watch or continue to watch coercive videos, R-rated and X-rated movies that show coercion and the acceptance of coercion, are more often to try to use this kind of hostile coercion with women. So the combination of being sexually promiscuous and then also very hostile and believing in this kind of hostile or aggressive behavior towards women to get what you want can often cause greater coercion against women. You guys need to know what social scripts are. Think of a social script as kind of your mental play out, the mental script, the mental dialogue of an unknown behavior to you. Often when behaviors are unknown or situations are new to a person, we will go back on whatever information we might possibly have about that situation, whether it's a book that we read, or more likely in today's day and age, what we've seen on television, on YouTube, wherever we get our media exposure from. When confronted with new situations, individuals may rely on these kind of scripts. If the scripts are violent in nature, people may act them out. This brings us back to Zimbardo's experiment. Those men that were in the Stanford prison study had absolutely no previous experience as being guards or any previous experience as being prisoners. The prisoners reacted with their social script, which is they were supposed to make life hard for the guards, and they did in kind. The guards reacted with what they thought was their social script, which was that they were supposed to control at all costs, and control by being dehumanizing. The idea of video games, do they teach or release violence? Here's the big one. When we talk about this, it's not always physical violence, but playing violent video games, adolescents and children will actually see the world as more hostile, and they'll get into more arguments after playing those kind of games. So it may not be physical violence, but it definitely is aggression that often happens. So engaging in aggressive role play or gameplay or anything like that does just naturally increase aggression, just like watching a comedy or watching things that are lighthearted make you feel happy and more caring and giving. Adolescents who play violent video games exhibit lingering effects on brain functioning, including increased activity in the region of the brain that governs emotional arousal, so your amygdala, decreased activity in the brain's executive functioning, okay, so your prefrontal cortex, which is associated with control, focus, and concentration. In other words, it has an emotional impact. Make sure that you look at all of these for aggressive behaviors. You should be good with the genetic, the biochemical, and the neural. You should also, even though we didn't get a chance to talk about it, drinking alcohol, depressants, those can have an influence. They may actually depress whether or not you actually run anything through your prefrontal cortex, which means that your amygdala is going to go a little bit stronger. You should know your frustration aggression principle and the idea of modeled behavior and aggressive rewards. Social cultural, de-individuation pops up here, so feeling like you are not identified amongst a crowd may increase aggressive behavior when the entire crowd acts aggressively, because your behavior might not be tied intimately into you. Environmental factors, crowding, heat, and direct provocation. So think of a really horrible family road trip. You're stuck in a hot car. You're packed in there with a bunch of other people. It's hot, and you have a sibling that's picking on you. Parents modeling aggression, minimal father interaction, being rejected from a group, and then exposure to violent media. Minimal father interaction or involvement, again, often keeps young men who have higher rates of testosterone in check. It also gives them a model to follow. And then being rejected from a group can cause aggression because it may be more of a reactive protective measure. If people don't like me, if I reject them first, then they can't reject me. Then we get into conflict. And conflict's fun because the social trap is the hardest thing in the world to explain. So, perceived incompatibility of actions, goals, or idea, that's conflict. A social trap is a situation where if everyone were to work together, they would get some of the benefit. If, however, each individual pursues their own self-interest, they get no benefit. So, situation in which conflicting parties may each rationally pursue their self-interest may become caught in a mutually destructive behavior. I'll explain it in the next slide a little bit better. All right, so let's just pretend that this social trap is set up and it's for money. So, person A is Steve and person B is Chris. If Steve were to choose to share the money, and it's $10, Steve could get $5 and Chris could get $5, but only if Chris chooses to share as well. However, if Chris decides not to share, Steven loses the $5 and Chris gets all 10. The flip of that, however, is that if Steven chooses not to share and Chris chooses to share, Steven gets to keep the $10 and Chris keeps nothing. But if each of them pursue their own self-interest, they both decide to keep the $10 themselves. If they both do that, then neither of them gets any money. And in a social trap, the probable outcome is that nobody walks away with money, that they both pursue their self-interest, they both say, I'll keep the $10, I'm not going to share, and therefore they get no money. The optimal outcome, but the one that is less likely to happen, is that they both choose to share and they both walk away with $5. No, I didn't lose my mind. I didn't set this up wrong. When we talk about enemy perceptions, this is, I know from a ways back, but I really hate politics, so I'm not going to come any closer to the current political climate. People in conflict form diabolical images of one another. So, George Bush here on the left called Saddam Hussein, who's on the right, a wicked pharaoh. Saddam Hussein, the wicked pharaoh, said that George Bush was just evil. So, when we're looking at this, neither of them had wonderful things to say. To get people to rally behind them, they made the other person an enemy. Now we're moving on to attraction. Matching hypothesis. Males and females of approximately equal physical attractiveness are likely to select each other as partners. So when we're looking at attraction, this is a horrible way of kind of getting this to kind of sit in your heads, but usually people, if you're doing a 1 to 10 scale, if someone's a 7, they're probably dating someone who's maybe a 6 and maybe an 8. If someone's a 2, they're most likely not dating anyone that is a 9 or a 10. Now, this is the likelihood. So the idea that people who are roughly about the same attractiveness level, they tend to pair up. The other thing that we see is that attitude similarity is correlated to attraction. We like people who are similar to us, act similarly, think similarly, and again, our attitudes become more aligned or congruent with people the longer we're with them. So dating partners start to show attitude alignment. What makes people attracted to each other? The first thing is what we call proximity. So literally physical proximity, being near somebody. So if you're never near somebody who lives on the other side of the world, you can't be attracted to them. But you can be attracted to that person that is in your school or that you have repeated exposure to. So repeated exposure to novel stimuli may increase their attraction. That's called the mere exposure effect. By merely being exposed to something unique or different, you may find it more attractive. So rare white penguin was born in the zoo and it was accepted after 3 weeks by the penguins just because it was around them. They were just exposed to them. Physical attractiveness. So once you have proximity, then physical attractiveness kind of plays in. So proximity affords contact. Then the next thing is whether or not you find them attractive. So youthfulness is often associated with health and fertility. So we tend to find things that look younger and healthier more attractive. So proximity, then attraction, and then after that it's similarity. So just because somebody is around somebody and that person is pretty to look at, if they're not similar to you, you may still find that person kind of off-putting. So the next thing is similarity. Similar views among individuals causes the strong or the bond of attraction to strengthen. There's the term birds of a feather flock together. Romantic couples usually have personalities that seem rather similar. And again, attitude similarity causes attraction, and here's that attitude alignment again. It's just this idea that we kind of like ourselves and we like elements that we see of ourselves reflected back to us in the people that we're with. In the video, if you have a chance to click on it, you're going to see the fact that cognition plays a role sometimes in arousal. So you're going to have a study, and there's a woman who is doing research on a kind of rope bridge that swings back and forth, and it's not very stable. And then the exact same woman doing research on a very stable concrete bridge. And the way that the research works is that she gives the people that she's talking to almost kind of like a pickup line, like, here, you can call me at my hotel if you'd like to hear more about this research. The men who saw her on the rickety bridge call more often than the men that call from the solid bridge. And the idea is that they had to make a decision about why their heart was pounding. Was their heart pounding because they were on this bridge that was unstable, or was their heart pounding because there was a beautiful woman in front of them? Which of those two emotions are they more likely to want to allow to be correct? Fear of the bridge or attraction to the woman? So the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion often plays a part. When we're looking at that, physical arousal plus a cognitive label may generate the idea that the reason my heart is pounding with this person nearby is because I'm attracted to them. And when we're talking about that kind of deep, all-encompassing kind of arousal state, intense positive absorption with another, the part that's like the really kind of knock you over the head part of the beginning of a relationship, that's passionate love. A lot of people love that beginning part of relationships where all you can do is think about the other person. All you want to do is talk to the other person. You are kind of consumed by that other person. That doesn't work forever. That level of intense attachment has to decrease at some point. So passionate love often has to give way to what we call companionate love. Deep affection and attachment we feel for those with whom our lives are intertwined. So most people who are in long and enduring relationships have companionate love. My favorite story of companionate love is between my grandfather and my grandmother, because I still have a picture of them where my grandmother kind of crawled up into my grandfather's lap at like the age of 60 and just kind of fell asleep on his lap, you know, one Christmas. And it was just adorable, but they loved each other, but they weren't pawing at each other. They weren't like all over each other, but they had this kind of, their lives began and ended with each other. With companionate love, there's usually a good amount of what we call equity. People have a give and take in their relationship, and it's equally weighted. Maybe not in the ways that you may personally want, but with them and that other person, things are split as close to 50-50 as possible. So what they give to the relationship, they get out of it. What they do for the other person does back. The other thing that you have is something called self-disclosure. So you reveal everything about yourself to the other person. When we talk about things like the Erickson's idea of whether or not you guys have achieved identity, or if you're still trying to figure yourself out, that's that kind of idea that when you get to intimacy, you're okay with self-disclosure because you already know who you are and you're happy with who you are. So you reveal the intimate aspects of yourself to the person that you are in love with. And then the idea of reciprocity, liking those who show that they like you. And so literally we like back those people who like us. And that might not always just be with love, but that can just be in general liking. Intimacy is going to refer to warmth, closeness, and sharing in a relationship. Commitment is the intent to maintain a relationship in spite of difficulties and costs that may arise. So intimacy and commitment increase over time, and passionate love has to decrease. And when we talk about commitment, commitment means that you're willing to see that person grow old and you're willing to argue with them, but you're willing to stick it out and be with that person. There's a great video, and I wish I had it linked in here for you guys, where you see a couple watch each other kind of do an age progression in front of each other. And it was right before they got married, and both of them thought it was a wonderful experience because the idea that they would be with each other through every step and every stage, and that, you know, as one of them got wrinkled and old, the other one would do the same with them, and that they would be committed throughout this, that they would never be alone. That's a pretty important thing. We also have Hazan and Shaver, and they go all the way back to Ainsworth. People's romantic relationships in adulthood are similar to their attachments in infancy, so that secure and insecure attachment now comes back up. Secure adults, 56%. That means that they had secure attachment as a child, so they find it relatively easy to get into a relationship with another adult. Anxious and ambivalent. This is going to be more of the jealous adult. They're going to question who you're with, or why you were gone so long, or whether or not you still love them, and it's going to be that kind of thing. They might also be the snoopers that go into your email accounts and check up on you. None of those are healthy behaviors. None of that indicates trust or commitment. Then you have the avoidant adults, about 24% of them, and they find it difficult to get close to others. In other words, they kind of build up a wall. So they have a hard time with intimacy. They have a hard time telling someone that they love them. They have a hard time letting people in. The last two, the avoidant and the anxious ambivalent, both of those are destructive. A newer look at attachment has people falling into two kind of continuums or two dimensions, with anxious anxiety and then attachment avoidance. So attachment's anxiety, how much people worry about their partners will not be available when they need them, and at the other end, the avoidance to the degree at which people feel uncomfortable with closeness or intimacy. The newer theories believe that these are kind of these two extremes that you may fall in, with kind of normality being somewhere in between. So attachment styles, again, if we're talking about attachment avoidance and then attachment anxiety, from high to low, and then again high to low, 56% of people are going to be secure. They are comfortable, they're intimate, and they also have a sense of autonomy. And we'll talk about this really cool thing. The more attached you become to somebody, the more autonomous you can also be, which sounds contradictory, but it's not. Then you have that 20 and the 24, and then the one that we didn't talk about, avoidant and fearful, and they just fear rejection, and so they are socially avoidant. They don't get into any kind of relationships. Now we're on to the topic of altruism. So unselfishness, being giving to others. So altruism's definition, being unselfish, having unselfish regard for the welfare of others. This is being kind, being considerate, going out of your way to help a stranger. The entire story of Kitty Genovese, you guys have read about this. Diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility is the idea that in a crowd, often the idea of responsibility is diffused, and we expect that the person next to us or the person next to them or the person next to them will be the person that stands up and does something. So diffusion of responsibility is part of the bystander apathy or the bystander effect. We are more likely to become an apathetic bystander, a person who doesn't act, when we diffuse our responsibility to those around us. I assume that the people around me have already acted, or I assume that the people around me have more ability to act than myself, so therefore I don't take it upon myself to act. People are less likely to provide help when they're in groups than when they are alone. And so you guys had the 40 studies on this. The more you are alone, the more likely you know you're the only person who can act. Add people into it, and as the numbers increase, you expect there to be an expert or somebody else that can do it around you. And just understand that those people are often thinking the same way. How does bystander intervention work? So this is different than apathy or bystander effect. Did you notice the incident? If the answer is no, you can't intervene. But if the answer is yes, then you move on to step number 2. Was it an emergency? If the answer is no, then there's no need to get help because there's no emergency. If the answer is yes, it is an emergency, then you move on to step 3. Do you personally assume responsibility? If you look around and you wait for someone else to take responsibility, that's where you have diffusion of responsibility. So if you think it's not your place, it's not your fault, you don't need to do anything, then you won't act. But if you feel that yes, you somehow have some responsibility by just being present and aware of the situation, then you'll attempt to help. Social exchange theory. Our social behavior is an exchange process. Maximize our benefits, minimize our costs. So social exchange theory, the norm is I help others with the expectation that they will help me in return. This also leads into the reciprocity norm, the expectation that we should return help to those and not harm those who have helped us. So you walk in, someone opens a door for you, reciprocity norm means that the next door you should hold open for them. That someone who's done something nice for you, you pay it forward, you do nice things for other people, or more importantly for that person. So your next door neighbor mows your yard, and next time it snows, you shovel their walkway. This idea of reciprocity. And then social responsibility norm, a norm that tells us to help others when they need help, even if they cannot repay us. And this often goes towards people who are very young or very old, people who are in some kind of mental or physical situation where they can't help themselves. Any of those things, we understand that it's our responsibility if we're able-bodied to help. Superordinate goals, shared goals that override differences among people and require their cooperation. This is usually going to be in large circumstances where we realize that group work or working as a collective is going to be what allows us to do better. You guys need to know GRIT, which is your Graduated Unreciprocated Initiatives in Tension Reduction. I really can't explain why this form of conciliation is present, but it's something that's there and we need to talk about. So this is a strategy to decrease international tension. So this is very much a political strategy. So let's just go back to Cold War USSR versus the United States. Let's say our president goes and is talking to the premier of the USSR, and they're talking about nuclear warheads. And so to open discussions, the US president will announce that they recognize that there is a mutual interest, like not having a nuclear holocaust. And so they offer a small conciliatory act. They're going to reduce their nuclear arms by 10%. The idea is that this should cause reciprocity. That by reducing it by 10%, then the USSR will sit there and go, well, we'll reduce it by 10% as well. And it essentially opens this idea of reciprocation and tension reduction.